Hey everybody, welcome to this All Tech is Human live stream. I'm Rebecca Tweed. I'm the Executive Director of All Tech is Human, and I am here with my colleague Sandra Khalil, the Head of Partnerships.
Hey,
So if
Rebecca,
this
how
is
are you?
Hey Sandra, I'm great. How are you?
Well, thanks.
Good. So if this is your first time joining us, just want to say welcome. We're really glad you're here. And a bit of background about us. All Tech is Human is a nonprofit. We're based in New York City. We connect thousands of people around the globe, and together we are building the world's largest multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary network in responsible technology. So we emphasize leveraging the collective intelligence in order to better tackle thorny tech and society issues and to co-create a tech future that's aligned with the public interest. We emphasize diversifying tech to include more backgrounds, disciplines, perspectives, lived experiences. And we do that in order to better meet the complex challenges that we face today. And we emphasize increasing the pace of tech consideration so that we can move at the speed of tech. Our work involves multi-stakeholder convening and community building, multidisciplinary education and resource development, and responsible tech career development. And we have focus areas including responsible AI, trust and safety, public interest technology, tech policy, cyber and democracy, and youth, tech, and well-being. So that's just a quick overview about what All Tech is Human is about, and you can find out more at alltechishuman.org. So Sandra, I would love to kick it over to you for a moment to give a quick rundown of what we've been up to recently, how people can get involved, and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. There are plenty of ways to get involved. The work never stops, and we're always looking to engage new members, looking to get involved in the community, seek careers, seek ways to, support others. We also are trying to lean into doing more live streams. So you'll be able to see us on a weekly or biweekly cadence, putting out great panels on these discussions, timely discussions, like the one today with Julia Angwin on TikTok ban. We have our next live stream on March 27th at 1 p.m. That's going to 1 p.m. Eastern. That's going to be on deepfakes and synthetic media, featuring Dr. Mary Ann Franks, Ben Coleman, and Belle Torek. I'll be moderating that discussion. We've also just announced two super exciting events in New York City. We're going to have a gathering on May 14th on the future of trust and safety at our co-working space in BetaWorks. We're really looking to keep cultivating the next generation of trust and safety workers, also illuminate pathways for non-traditional tech folks to break into spaces like trust and safety. It's important also for us to keep merging the emerging and the established together for more knowledge sharing and collaboration around these topics. So be on the lookout for, I think our interest form for that gathering is up. We're also sending out a save the date for the Responsible Tech Summit. That's our annual gathering in September. This year, it'll fall on September 16th. So if you're in town for UNGA, if you're in town for other meetings, we'd love to have you. So please sign up for both interest forms. They can be found on our website. And stay tuned for confirmed speakers, confirmed programming, and more about that. Our working groups are also underway. Rebecca and I are tackling that effort together to build out resources that really help you understand the 6 verticals more deeply. Alongside that, we're also looking at building out a curriculum. So if that's something you're interested in getting involved in, we are project planning how to deliver a curriculum to the community that could serve as a foundation for your entry point into the community. And finally, I just want to say a quick congratulations to our 5th cohort of mentors and mentees. We've been so happy to offer that program to folks in the space, and it's been a big effort from our colleague Sarah Welsh. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Sandra. So Sandra mentioned today, this live stream, it's the 4th in our weekly live stream series on responsible tech. So you can find all of those and a lot more on our YouTube channel. So please look for those. Today, we're going to be featuring Julia Angwin in conversation with All Tech is Human program manager Josh Chapdelaine about the recent vote in the US Congress to force TikTok to divest from its Chinese ownership or be banned from the US market. If you are watching us live and you have a question for Julia, please go ahead and drop it in the chat. And also be sure to let us know where you are viewing the live stream from. We just want to know who's tuning in. So thanks for joining us. And with that, we will get to the good stuff and bring on Josh to introduce today's featured guest. Hey, Josh.
Hey everyone, thank you so much, Rebecca and Sandra. It was a pleasure to have you both introduce us, and it's wonderful to hear about all the great things happening at All Tech is Human. And it is my pleasure to introduce today's guest for our live stream about the TikTok ban. Julia Angwin is an award-winning investigative journalist, a best-selling author, a New York Times contributing opinion writer, and a Walter Shorenstein Media and Democracy Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy. She is the founder of Proof News, a new nonprofit journalism studio launching in 2024. In 2018, she founded the Markup, a nonprofit newsroom that investigates the impacts of technology on society. Julia, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you?
Hello, I'm here. Thanks for having me, and now I'm unmuted.
Yes, thank you so much for being here. And we have a lot to get to today and not so much time. So I would love to dive into the conversation immediately. So, can you walk us through the US House of Representatives vote on Wednesday, March 13th? What does it mean for TikTok, and what does it mean for its parent company, ByteDance?
Yeah, we saw like a real rare episode of true bipartisanship. Honestly, Congress seems to be united in its concerns about TikTok, or at least the House is. They had an overwhelming majority vote to force on a bill that would basically force TikTok to sell. ByteDance is its parent company. They're based in China, and so it would force ByteDance to sell TikTok to basically an owner that the US deems appropriate. So there's basically a requirement that the US review who the new buyer would be. And if that doesn't happen in 6 months, the bill requires TikTok to be banned in the US. What that sort of means is basically requiring the app stores that offer the TikTok app to take it off. It is a little bit weird because it would probably still stay on your phone for a little while. And then if maybe without updates, it might become like less usable. But it's actually hard to imagine how they would actually remove it from everyone's phone.
And so it's similar to a Flappy Bird situation where in 2013, the app was removed from the App Store, but people still had it and were able to use it. Now, this is very US centric, and the app in theory would still be available globally. But interestingly enough, you write about the disconnect between what Americans want and the type of policies being proposed around tech platforms. So, can you help us identify the major issues Americans are interested in and where legislators are missing the mark?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that really just struck me right away with the TikTok ban was this disconnect from what the public wants, right? Like there's not currently a groundswell of people crying out for a TikTok ban. The latest polling shows that about 30% of Americans would support a TikTok ban, and it's not clear if all of those people were very enthusiastic about it. And there is a lot of enthusiasm, though, for privacy legislation. So 70+% of Americans want federal privacy legislation that would basically put some limits on how their data is used by commercial actors. And we are one of the only countries that doesn't have sort of comprehensive baseline privacy protections. And yet Congress has continued to fail to pass a law on that, despite having one that was had strong bipartisan support in the last session of Congress. And so I think this is one of many issues where Congress is really disconnected from the public, right? This is not the top issue that I think most Americans are polling about what they're worried about, which is like, housing, privacy, like guns, abortion. There's a lot of things that Americans actually pretty much want. Um, and the Congress is not acting on them. And instead, it's taking this TikTok issue and basically made it into this sort of China scare story of like, okay, China's got all our data and we need to be scared. And yet they haven't provided any evidence about why we should be scared. So we're all very confused.
And so, how can legislators better address the desires of their constituents around issues like data privacy and transparency in the United States, even if we're looking at what other countries are doing around the world?
Well, the good news is that since we're so late to the game in tech regulation in the United States, there are plenty of models to choose from. So probably the most natural model is Europe. So they have got a very strong privacy law called GDPR that has been in place for almost a decade and is uh, I think we've learned a lot from what GDPR offers, and California actually passed a law kind of similar to GDPR, but improves upon it. Um, because some of the problems with GDPR was that those little boxes that show up saying, "Do you consent to these cookies?" That sort of was their big privacy move. And in fact, everyone just clicks yes. So it didn't end up really improving a lot of people's privacy. But Europe has just passed a new package of laws, the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, that are actually really innovative tech regulations. They essentially identified the big platforms and put special obligations on them. And those obligations have to do with partly assessing the risk of their algorithms. I think we're now in an era where we realize it's not just the data, but also the algorithms that are troubling, right? The fact that you can't control what you see on your feed, and that these companies have such great control over it, and they can really turn that dial whatever way they want to boost or amplify the type of content that they want. We've definitely seen this with the new ownership of Twitter, where the owner Elon Musk has really chosen to promote some pretty outrageous and offensive material through his algorithm.
Yeah, and part of the algorithmic concern, especially in the United States in 2024, is related to the type of content that might be shown or not shown during a pivotal election year in this country. And between data privacy concerns and criticisms that, like you said, scare of China, and whether or not they'd be able to access that data through other US centric platforms is similar in nature. But there are but the spread of mis and disinformation, specifically as it pertains to algorithms, relates directly to the fear of potential election interference on TikTok. But there were some interesting findings in February from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence about this. Can you unpack what those findings were and how they pertain to TikTok and its ban?
Yes, absolutely. So basically, the argument that's been made about TikTok is that China is going to have our data, and they're going to use it to manipulate us, or to is weaponize it in some way against the US. And because they have all the data about these TikTok viewers. First of all, it's worth noting that TikTok claims it keeps the data about US viewers separate, and that China can't access it. But there have been instances where it's been proven that there have been some China individual employees of ByteDance who've accessed it. So we don't know how strict that line is. But one other thing we don't know is what the intelligence and national security community really thinks is happening with this data. The one clue we have is this February threat assessment report that the Office of the Director of National Intelligence put out. And in that report, they said that they had evidence that there were Chinese government run accounts that were put on TikTok in the 2022 midterm elections to target US candidates. And so, that sounds a little bit scary. It's not totally clear. They didn't spell out what exactly that targeting looked like. But it's also worth noting that basically it doesn't require you to own an app to make an account to target someone, right? I mean, we have seen this multiple times. There's bots on all of our social media, and there are different fake accounts that do weird things. And we saw this in 2016 when the Russian government put together some bots and some actual humans who made fake accounts on Facebook. And they actually were quite successful in spreading a lot of disinformation and trying to put together these influence campaigns to get certain sectors of voters to be not interested in voting. And so what we know about this is that all of these social media platforms are basically kind of perfectly designed for influence campaigns. And there's not a lot stopping any actor, state actor, non-state actor, from creating accounts and trying to use them to create influence. So really the question is, was TikTok itself part of this? Did they promote those accounts with their algorithm? And what we do, and the report from the National Intelligence Committee basically didn't say that. It didn't say that the algorithm was promoting it. So we don't know if they have any evidence that TikTok was participating in this. And I think that's a really key question that we would want to have answered before going ahead with something so aggressive as a ban.
And one of the key concerns about that ban is that The alternative to the ban would be offloading TikTok to a US-based company. So why do you believe that selling TikTok to a US-based company wouldn't adequately address these consumer and legislative concerns?
Well, we already know that one of the buyers, people who wants to buy TikTok, is Steven Mnuchin. He was the Treasury Secretary under Trump. Political, he has a political agenda, right? He was part of the Trump administration. He's a billionaire. He's trying to put together a group, and so more likely than not, he is going to have his own political agenda that he wants to push through TikTok, and so will other buyers. The reality is TikTok is really expensive, so it's going to have to be some sort of billionaire consortium of some kind. And what we have seen is that people with money are realizing that owning these types of media properties is a great way to push their agenda. And so we're just going to trade one agenda for another. And I don't know if China has actually been using it to push their agenda. There hasn't actually been compelling evidence there, but let's say that they were. It's interesting because you know what? Also, China's agenda. What we know about China's agenda is like we know that they interfered with Zoom, which also has Chinese ownership. There were 6 employees who were just prosecuted by the Justice Department recently from Zoom who were actually interfering actively with Zoom calls that Chinese dissidents were trying to have. And so we know that China is very concerned about cracking down on dissidents. But what we don't know is actually they're trying to interfere with our elections in any way. And I'm not saying that cracking down on Chinese dissidents is a good idea, but I'm saying we're trading one type of interference for another doesn't feel like a solution to me. A solution to me feels like some sort of understanding of like how can we force all the platforms to be more transparent about what their algorithms are boosting and what they're not boosting, and giving the public some oversight, accountability, and control over those algorithms, which is what Europe has done with its Digital Services Act.
Yeah, and Europe has a head start on us in the United States. I would like to take this opportunity to remind everyone in attendance that if you would like to write in a question, we will be bringing up questions in just a few minutes. So this is your opportunity to write something in for your opportunity to have it read and discussed on this live stream. So moving on, I'm really curious, Julia, what can policymakers and tech companies do to create a better infrastructure that centers privacy and transparency? Because, like you said, we learn about specific instances and we see specific policy, but how do you build that level of public trust and accountability and access that you're referring to?
I mean, I think that one really key part of all of this is transparency. People really want to know how their data is being used, what type of data is being collected, and they also want some bright lines about whether ways that that data can be used. So, one story that recently came out from the great reporter Kashmir Hill at the New York Times was about how some connected cars are collecting data about sort of your accelerating and your braking patterns, and then some of those consumers found that that data was actually being uploaded into reports on LexisNexis that insurance brokers were using to set their insurance rates. And that's exactly the kind of use of data that is unexpected and has is harmful and is something that people have no knowledge or ability to control, right? When they bought these cars, they were not aware that it was going to do this. And this is constantly happening, right? You browse the web, you look on a website, then all of a sudden you're getting an email from somebody saying, like, I saw you were on this website. And you're like, who the hell is this person? And so I think we have this unregulated ecosystem right now where your data is being transmitted through our devices to all sorts of different players. They are then sending it to other third players who are then sending it to someone else. And there's no limits and no rules on it right now. You know, one thing I always say as a joke, but it's kind of true, is that China could just go buy all this data from data brokers right now. The Biden administration did, I think, pass an executive order recently that aims to limit data brokers from selling to foreign adversaries. And so maybe for the first time ever, it's not possible to sell directly to China, but that doesn't mean that you couldn't sell it to someone who would then sell it to them. So we just don't have any sort of minimum standards right now about like the data that you're transmitting should only be used for the purpose that you transmitted it for. And then if they want to use it for something else, they have to ask. And we don't have any sort of rules about algorithmic transparency and how we can see how the algorithm is targeting us and what kind of decisions are being made about what content we see. So those are the bare minimum standards that I think have been sorted out through most other countries have put in some version of these two things. And so it seems like that's where we should start.
And I think those are great starting points. As you were discussing some of the new orders about data, I'm curious, if the TikTok ban were to take place in the United States, how would it influence the app globally? And what are the impacts of this um, for people in the global South, for instance? Will this actually matter?
I mean, I think a TikTok ban would be a really big deal. Like, first of all, there are thousands of businesses that sell on TikTok. TikTok is actually kind of like Etsy. It's a marketplace. And some people would say, myself included, that watching TikTok these days is a little bit too much selling. They have this TikTok shop, and all these little small businesses are trying to sell you things. And so it's actually a pretty important economic engine inside the US. So, first of all, I think the ban would impact a lot of small businesses, and you saw a lot of them protesting. And obviously, it would affect a lot of influencers who make their money through brand deals or whatever that they do to support the videos that they make. So, there's a whole economy that would suffer from this ban. And then when you talk about the rest of the world, well, what they have is like a weird app that's just kind of missing a hole. There's no United States info in there. And so it just becomes like a very weird ecosystem. And I think honestly, it means that there would be even more attempts to circumvent the ban. I think there would be a lot of people inside the US trying to use VPNs and other ways to access TikTok. It's like a lot of bans. They're usually not that successful, right? Like China's been trying to ban all these companies for a long time, and people still use VPNs to access them. So I think we also have to recognize that bans are not always that successful.
Yeah, it's very, very tricky to enforce a ban, and as you're saying, easy to circumvent it. And with that, I would love to get into the question and answer portion of this. We did receive our first question from Julie Skelfo. Julie writes, "Hi, Julia. What do you think it would take for the United States to adopt something comparable to GDPR?"
The funny thing is, we had a bill that was fairly close, the ADPPA, which was I'm going to forget what the acronym stands for, but it was a bipartisan piece of legislation. It was sort of the first federal comprehensive privacy legislation that got any momentum in the last Congress, and it was actually somewhat comparable to GDPR and slightly better because it was more recent. So it had some of the algorithmic assessments that GDPR did not have. And it also had some really strict rules on data privacy, and it didn't fall into the trap of just saying that, oh, those little consent boxes for your cookies is enough consent. So we did have a model like that. And what happened is that basically, since we have gone so long without passing a privacy law, a lot of countries have had them for at least a decade. Many states also have passed their own privacy laws. So what's happened is there's competing privacy laws out there at the state level. And so it wasn't possible to reconcile them with this federal version because the federal law was going to basically supersede those state laws. And California in particular, the lawmakers from California were pretty upset because they had passed a very strong privacy bill, and the federal one was slightly weaker in their mind. So it's gotten hung up on this sort of federal versus state question. And what I think is sort of depressing about it is that there was a way to solve that problem. The federal bill didn't have to supersede the state laws. It could have just been a floor. And then if a state wanted to add additional protections on top of that, they could add on top of it. And so that would be the normal way to do a federal law in that situation. But in this case, it was actually attempting to be a ceiling. Like no state could pass a law that was stronger than the federal law. And so I think that is the issue that has to be solved to get this moving next time.
Yeah. And I think that's really valuable guidance. And we have a very active LinkedIn chat right now. So if you're on the go and you're not on the chat, I do invite you all to join. I'd like to highlight a comment that Kimberly Owens wrote and then bring up a question related to Kimberly's comment. Kimberly writes, fake accounts have existed on all social media platforms for a while. Plus, if China wanted our data, they could just buy it from a data broker, similar to what you were saying, Julia. And then our question from Maranisa says, to Kimberly Owens, excellent points. Would you advise that we get privacy regulation passed before algorithmic transparency for practical purposes, or does it make more strategic sense to include both goals in one legislation piece together?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, to me, I honestly just want both, and so I don't really care what order they come in. But I think to zoom out a little bit, that goes back to sort of a constant debate in the privacy community, which is really whether restrictions on collection or restrictions on use are going to be more meaningful. And in some ways, when we talk about privacy, we are often talking about the collection, and when we talk about algorithmic transparency, we're talking about the use, right? How is your data being used to target you? And I guess I sort of feel that use restrictions are some maybe easier to pass, um, because they're so clearly based on, there's a clear harm argument. A lot of times the collection arguments of like, don't collect this data, they get run aground when people say, well, we don't know that anyone's using it harmfully. So I guess if I was going to go for the lowest hanging fruit, I would say, let's ban harmful things, which is ways that your data is being used to harm you, and or that is being used to not necessarily always harm, right? Algorithmic harms can be weirdly about you not seeing an opportunity, which isn't the same as a direct economic harm, but basically like you're missing out on seeing something. So I think I would say that would be my first choice if I had to pick one, but it's sort of like asking me to pick between my two children. I love them both.
Yeah, and that's such a tricky place to be put in. So, we won't ask you to pick, but we
Thank
will.
you.
But Kimberly Owens will ask you for your take on the ban of TikTok as a First Amendment issue.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I will tell you this, I'm not a First Amendment lawyer, but the First Amendment lawyers who I read and follow all seem to feel very strongly that it's a First Amendment issue. And they seem to think that they're going to win some cases on it. So I think there's also a real question is if this goes to a ban, would it even be upheld in the courts? And I think that's a tricky question because I think we're seeing a Supreme Court these days that's pretty political. And so it's not, I think it's hard to predict sometimes where they're going to come down on things unless you know the political angle that they're trying to take there. But I do think there's a real First Amendment question about the government basically stepping in to take control of a private company and say, hey, we want you to basically conform to speech requirements that we have set. The weird thing about this particular issue is they haven't really set the speech requirements. They've just said we want US ownership. And weirdly, that US ownership does not actually imply necessarily more free speech. You know, we've seen with Elon Musk owning X that he just bans journalists that he doesn't like, or actually people he doesn't like. So it's not like he's a free speech proponent just because he's based in the US.
Right, right. There's definitely a false equivalency there. And this is all really part of the thorny growth of technology and social media platforms. And there are definitely platforms that are trying to get ahead of this kind of regulation and oversight from the policy side. And I think Paul Roberts's question really speaks to that because Paul asks, how big is the voluntary privacy by design push among companies, perhaps as a strategy to stave off regulation? And do some companies promise privacy commitments with one hand and then transgress with the other?
Well, that's a great question. You know, I have to say, as a reporter who has covered the tech industry for multiple decades, I'm revealing my age. Um, I am pretty cynical about the voluntary commitments that companies try to make, right? So they basically say, we are building in privacy by design. We love privacy. We are so committed, etc. That's really pretty meaningless, and it has proven to be pretty meaningless just over and over again. And we're seeing that same thing play out with AI right now, by the way, right? The companies are saying, oh, don't worry, we're making all these pledges. We're going to make sure that AI doesn't kill you. It's going to be great. Don't regulate it. And the secret message underneath all that is don't regulate us. And by the way, so far Congress has listened to them and not regulated them. Like, we have an incredibly unregulated tech industry. So that does work in part because these companies are hugely profitable. They donate a lot to lobbying, to campaigns, to political candidates, to political parties. So they're very big political players. And also they constantly wave the threat that, like, if you regulate us, we're not going to be as profitable, and also we'll lose the race with China. Do you remember how they were always talking about, if you regulate AI, we're going to lose the race on AI with China? So they're, as the engines of our economy, they do have a lot of leverage, and they have used it to basically keep regulation at bay.
Yeah, and keeping regulation at bay seems to be something that the companies are trying to do. We have a policy-based question. Shazin asks, even though it's going to say LinkedIn user, will the Data Care Act of 2023 impact the ban?
Oh dear, I don't know the Data Care Act
And
of 2023, so somebody's going to have to enlighten
I
me.
will. I'll provide some official context. It looks like the bill imposes various duties on online service providers with respect to their handling of individual identifying data that can be reasonably linked to a specific user. So that might be a question for another day.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, thank you for asking the question. Nevertheless, I think that ultimately, though, speaks to this concern about what the public is really viewing as, how do we solve this from the policy side, and how do we create stronger links between industry and policymakers so that we can create this better tech future, which is ultimately our mission here at All Tech is Human. But we're trying really hard to make sense of this ban, right? From the political level, from the policy level, and on the individual citizen level. And so, in closing, Julia, thank you so much for your time. Do you have any closing thoughts on the state of where we are with TikTok now, and how you might advise people grapple with this and have conversations about this moving forward as to make a better tech future?
I mean, I guess I would just ask people to think about, um, who do they want as the owner of TikTok among the all of our brilliant billionaire choices, and then think about why you don't want those people. And the reason is because it gives them so much power over what you see and what content is available. And right now, I think we haven't seen a lot of evidence of them manipulating the algorithm. People have tried to find this evidence, they haven't really seen it. And so I'm not saying that we should let them be unregulated, but I think we want to think about the fact that anyone who owns these algorithms has a lot of responsibilities to the public, and we have not imposed those responsibilities in a way that makes them really liable and respond and having to be responsive to us as the public.
Yes, and accountability seems to be the theme of this conversation. So, Julia, thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for the work you do at Proof
Thank you.
News. It is an absolute honor to have you for this conversation. And where can people keep up with you best?
So if you don't mind, I just like to promote my new journalism venture, Proof News. We just launched a couple weeks ago, and we are doing accountability journalism on tech and on other issues. Climate is coming up, but basically attempting to hold these companies' feet to the fire, because right now regulators are not doing it.
Yes, and we look forward to all of your work, and we'll continue to promote it
Thank
as
you.
well. Thank you, Julia, and thank you all for joining us. To keep up with All Tech is Human, head on over to alltechishuman.org for our latest, and we have plenty of links and resources for you to join, including our newsletter, our Slack, our in-person gatherings, and more. Have a healthy and safe rest of your week, and we will see you soon.